Affleck is such an interesting one because he
Hmm.
became a director after he had, I don't know if you want to say that he had become a failed movie star, but he was in a bad place for a while as
Yeah.
an actor. He had the stench of Gigli following him around wherever he went.
Oh God.
And he was more tabloid fodder than silver screen star. And
Yeah.
then he started directing movies, and you were like, oh, he's supremely talented.
Yeah.
He's not one of my favorite directors or anything, but he
Sure.
really has an eye for film. And you listen to interviews with him. He's been doing a lot of interviews with Damon recently because of Air,
Hmm. Hmm.
and those guys just they love movies.
They
Oh
do.
man, they love movies, and
Yeah.
I love that about them. And they speak so eloquently, and despite the fact that they do have kind of this persona of Boston bros or whatever, they're very thoughtful with the way
They
they
are.
talk about their art form,
There's
and
a
I really love that.
sophistication. There's something weirdly
Yes.
sophisticated about their, I don't want to use the word machismo, but their brotherly dynamic, which you might not perceive as, I guess, delicate and sophisticated in that way. And I feel like with Ben Affleck, he's sort of in the opposite camp as someone like Denzel Washington, which you brought up earlier. In that, Denzel mostly puts himself in his own movies up
Hmm.
until his most recent feature, whereas Ben Affleck was kind of the opposite. I mean, his first movie didn't even feature him, and then everything else kind of did.
Yeah, that's right. He was in
Yeah.
Argo. He was in The Way Back. He was in. Um,
Well, he didn't direct The Way Back, but he was in it.
oh, that's right. No, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right.
But there was The Town. There
He
was, you
wasn't in
mentioned
The
Art.
Town.
Uh, yeah, he was in The Town.
Oh no, sorry, not The Town. I was thinking of Gone Baby Gone.
You're thinking of, yeah, he was not in
Um,
Gone Baby Gone, which starred his brother. But there was also Live by Night, which is arguably his worst feature. I think many people would agree with that. But he kind of
yeah,
went on this opposite trend of
he's
pulling himself
barely in
back a bit.
Air.
What's it? Barely in? Yeah, I
He's
mean,
like not in it that much.
yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, that's a strange movie. I think we can have a further dissection on that one. There'd be a lot to talk about. I think that movie was kind of butchered by other things outside of Ben Affleck's ability as an actor and director. Let's throw out a few other names that we had on our list as far as some of our most notable ones that we thought of with
Yeah.
regard to actors turned directors. The first name that came, well, there's actually two names that came to mind first. One of them I do want to just say and get out of the way because I don't want to focus on this individual too much, mostly because I don't know if I would consider him an actor turned director by the most literal definition. And that is perhaps my favorite filmmaker, Charlie Chaplin. And because
Yeah.
I mean, he certainly has a visual acting artistic presence, but I mean, in some ways, he was always directing his own short films that then eventually became feature films. So he was kind of always equally a director as he was an actor. And I did think of that name, and in actuality, he would probably be the first one that I want to talk about here. In many ways, he is, but I think there are more examples we can think of those who were seen by the public eye as actors first, who then decided, I am going to try my hand at directing a movie. And in that regard, the first name that came to mind was Clint Eastwood. Well, of
Oh yeah.
course, Clint
Big time.
Eastwood, yeah, like the spaghetti western man himself, mostly working with Sergio Leone. That was really his claim to fame with the Dollars trilogy there, or the Man with No Name trilogy, whatever you want to call it. But then, testing out his abilities as a director and his career as a director is one of the most fascinating. I think I feel like it's one of the most literal definitions of peaks and valleys because
A lot of movies.
a lot of movies, not all of them great, but the ones that are great are kind of amazing.
Yeah.
I love his debut film, Play Misty, for me. I think that's a really effective film. Of course, he starred in that as well. But it wasn't until, I mean, he had some hits before Unforgiven, but I feel like Unforgiven was the moment where we really took him seriously as a director. I think he did a lot of great films before that, such
Yeah,
as
he
The
did a
Outlaw
bunch
Joseph
of Pale
Wales,
Pale Rider.
Hell
He
Rider,
did some big westerns. But I
yeah,
think you're
The
kind of
Outlaw
right. It was
Josie
like, oh well,
Wales,
Clint doing a western, of course, obviously he can do that, and then
yeah,
he kind of reverse it, flips the western on its head, and then he does some other
yeah.
there's an argument to be made that Bridges of Madison County is actually his best movie, and that movie feels
I
so
really like
far
that movie.
afield
I
from.
really like that
Yeah,
movie.
I love that movie, and
Yeah.
it's so far away from everything that Eastwood was known for in his
Yeah.
movie star career and his early directing career, for the most
Yeah.
part. Clint's the man. He's the man. He's
He is.
making another one. He's like 95.
He's
Let's do it.
apparently this might be his last one. And
That's
I'm
probably what he said last time.
I mean, yeah, with Cry Macho, I think it was, which I admittedly haven't even seen yet. But, I look at his career, and even before Unforgiven, where we really saw the awards attention that he received, even movies like Bird, which I'm not sure if you've ever seen.
I haven't seen it.
That's I mean, if you love jazz music, it's a really good movie, obviously detailing the life of Charlie Parker. But that was, I think if it wasn't for Unforgiven, I feel like we'd be looking at Bird as perhaps the real transition point and looking at him as a real director. But interestingly, even further from that, I feel like Mystic River in 2002 was almost like a rebirth of sorts, almost like a new debut. It felt like a completely different movie when Mystic River came out. And that one was focused on all of these actors outside of just Clint himself. And it was a really interesting change of pace. And since then he kind of developed this like raw, gritty, old fashioned aesthetic that was always there, but became even more prevalent in the early 2000s onward.
Yeah. I mean, you look at his last 15 years of movies.
Yeah.
And especially even mostly the last 10 years, they are very chopped down, explorations of great people doing great things most of the time is what he's been doing. And then every now and then he's like, hey, can I make a Jersey Boys movie? And you're like, Warner Brothers is like, look, you can do whatever you want. You've been doing it for this long. We'll let you do whatever you want.
I love Clint, but I don't think he was the right director for Jersey Boys.
Yeah, it's a wild career, and going back to again all of those films. I mean, you look at he did the Mandela movie. He did the J. Edgar Hoover movie. He did the Sully movie. He did American Sniper. He did the Richard Jewell movie. He did the 1517 to Paris. It's all these stories about very specific, what in his mind were, to one degree or another, heroes, or at the very least, iconic human beings. And I think he's been very good at that for the last decade plus. But you go beyond that, again, some of his 90s, early 2000s stuff is like fantastic and not as stripped down. Some of it is a lot more lavish than what we're used to him, what we're used to from him at this point. And it is one of those things where I think he learned from some of the legends that he worked with growing up or in the industry, and took so many of those lessons. And apparently Bradley Cooper is really a disciple of Eastwood, is what he has said. He said everything that he has kind of learned as a director, he learned from Clint.
I could see that. I can really see that. Do you have a favorite Clint Eastwood film that he directed specifically?
I mean, boring answer is probably Unforgiven. But if it's not
so
Unforgiven,
good,
it's Bridges of Madison County. Yeah.
Now that's interesting. If it's not Unforgiven for me, it might be $1 Million Baby, honestly.
It's a great movie. Great movie.
Yeah. I love that one quite a bit. Who's another name as far as actors turned directors that you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, so you mentioned Charlie Chaplin's, who to me was always equal parts actor and director.
Agreed.
Kind of aligning with the Affleck of it all. I thought more about people who were actors and then turned to directors.
Yeah.
And so along the same lines as Clint, I thought of Robert Redford.
Who is had him on my list as well.
Not, in my opinion, one of my favorite directors again. I think he's made some very bad films. And I'm not sure he's made, in my opinion, a great film, but it is funny when you go back and look at his kind of generation, and I would say he's in the same generation as an Eastwood, as I'm sure we'll talk about him eventually, a Ron Howard. These people who got in the industry young, understood the process, understood the expectations of making a movie, and got the clout within the industry to be like, okay, I would like to make a movie, please. And so they
Yeah.
got to make a movie. And Redford has had a tremendous amount of success, commercially and critically as a filmmaker. I'm not even sure what my favorite movie that he's directed
I haven't seen them
is.
all. I'm admittedly pretty blind to some of his more recent offerings. Like I haven't seen The Company You Keep. I haven't seen Lions for Lambs actually. Um, I really like Quiz Show. I think Quiz Show
I
is a
think that's my
really
favorite, just kind of
yeah,
by
okay.
default.
Okay. I know a lot of people might say Ordinary People nowadays, and I feel like there's been a bit of a resurgence, a critical resurgence for that film, and it is one I am admittedly due for a rewatch, but
I'm the same
my
way.
my gut instinct right now is to say Quiz Show. I think that's a really interesting movie.
I agree with you. That's a good film. I wouldn't call it a great film, but
I'd be pretty close to great. If I look back at the year 1994 and I try and do a top 10 based on what films I've seen from that year, it might make it. I don't know.
that's a good year. I mean, that's a
That's a
famous movie
really
year.
good year. Yeah, it's a famous movie year. You're right.
But I mean, you look at Legend of Bagger Vance and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It is a checkered filmography to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
But he's kept making movies. He's made what, like 8 or 9 movies, I think.
Yeah.
And that's over the course of 40 years. So it's not like he's the most prolific filmmaker of all time or anything.
Right.
But he clearly really enjoys being a director, and he just got to the point. If you look over the course of history, these guys who just got big enough where they could ask, "Can I direct a movie?" and the studio was like, I mean, if we say no, you'll probably never make a movie as an actor with our studio again. So, okay, that's fine. For him, he enjoyed it enough, and he was obviously successul enough with Ordinary People that he just got to keep making movies.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really cool thing. And, between the parallels between Clint Eastwood and Ron Howard are kind of undeniable as just these people who churn out commercially successful, I would say largely unremarkable, but occasionally great movies.
Mm-hmm.
I think the peaks of Howard and Eastwood far surpass the peaks of a Redford. But
yeah, I'm with you on that, especially with someone like Ron Howard, who, it's interesting because we're talking about actors turned directors with the mindset of people from Hollywood that we saw as actors first and then who tried their hand at directing, where someone like Ron Howard, I think nowadays is mostly seen as a director. And maybe that's because he primarily came from television as an actor. And maybe that had something to do with it, that it just transcends the, not transcends, but it's such a transition in the art form that it almost feels disconnected. Which is why another name I want to bring up that I think is maybe even more comparable in that way is someone like a Rob Reiner, who.
Oh man, I didn't even think about him because I hardly think of him as an actor. But you're right.
Yeah,
right.
Who was it? Meathead from All in the Family. Really, really funny comedic presence as a supporting role in that show. But you look at his filmography in the '80s, especially. I mean, there's an argument to be made that he was maybe the most bankable filmmaker of the '80s outside of Steven Spielberg. I mean,
he's got one of the all-time runs.
He really does. And now, admittedly, I haven't seen a movie like The Sure Thing, his second film after This Is Spinal Tap, but from what I understand, it was still a fairly modest hit. But then you also have Stand By Me, you have Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery. So I just mentioned 2 films that were based on Stephen King novels, and those two are widely considered to be among the best adaptations of any of his works.
Yeah.
And then even A Few Good Men, which has a great following as well. It's not until he went north that he just completely lost it. But yeah, that run from 84 through 92 is kind of unstoppable.
Yeah, it's so funny thinking about how present he was in American culture then, because he's still making movies, folks.
He is.
Regularly. And no one in America knows it. He has just become. All due respect to the man, he's had a great career, incredible amount of success. Irrelevant is what
Yeah.
he has become,
Yeah.
and it's fascinating. And even after he had a little bit of a comeback with the American president there after North, and
Mm.
then that's really when he kind of started going into obscurity. Although I feel like The Bucket List made a lot of money, but
Well,
I
that's the
don't
thing.
know.
Yeah, I'm noticing that some of his later films, when I say some, I mean really The Bucket List more than anything else, was definitely a hit with audiences, and a lot of people seem to like that one. There was definitely a disconnect between audiences and critics on that one, but it was a bit of a hit from what I understand, and I know a lot of people really liked it.